I want to thank the organizers of the Asia Business Conference for organizing the event and inviting me to be here. It's a real delight, pleasure, and honor for me to be here after such a long time since I was in this beautiful city of Cambridge. I'm going to try to spend the next few minutes taking you on a journey where Asia has been able to shape and also be shaped by the world in the last few thousand years. As you know, Asia is at a watershed moment, having gone from what it would have been in the past and at a point where it's likely to be able to influence the world on an unprecedented basis. Many would argue that the first industrial revolution would have been precipitated by an event in 1752 when a guy tried to find and fly a kite in the middle of a rain that later on became the source of electricity. But some would argue that the first real industrial revolution actually took place about 100,000 years ago, when humanity discovered fire, by way of which we were able to digest food a little bit better. We were able to outsource our digestive process a little bit more efficiently and effectively. Going forward a few tens of thousands of years, something dramatic happened in the northern part of Sumatra, which is one of the islands of the Indonesian archipelago, around 75,000 years ago, by way of what we call or know as the Toba volcanic eruption. It spewed more than 7 billion tons of materials that traveled around the world, more so than not in Asia, and it caused climactic aberrations to the point we saw thousands of years of cooling. If you think the weather outside is cold, try being there 75,000 years ago. And some would even argue that that might have precipitated the cognitive revolution that took place about 70,000 years ago. For some reason, the size of the human brain became bigger, and humanity was able to learn, exchange ideas. And fast forward to about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, another place in Asia, particularly in Sumeria, in what was known as the Mesopotamia, sandwiched by the two rivers of Tigris and Euphrates, humanity, through Asians, discovered the ability to write. The ability to write as for us to be able to outsource our memory, as for us to be able to express thoughts, ideas, innovations, one of which would have been the discovery of the wheels, which allowed humanity to outsource our legs, our manual labor. As a result of these two phenomena, we've been able to collapse time, space, and cost, or money. It all took place in Asia, thousands of years ago. Then, soon thereafter, our spiritual landscape changed. We began with the process of polytheism, which later on evolved to the process of monotheism, and as a result of which came the three Abrahamic religious beliefs of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All these took place in some parts of Asia, thousands of years ago. Fast forward to the 7th and 8th centuries, somewhere in China, people discovered it was a cool thing to just reflect upon a piece of paper for the purpose of transacting with each other by way of a piece of paper. In some countries, they call it "in God we trust," but in China, "in paper we trust." And this was the foundation for how humanity's ability to entrust each other for the purpose of economic activities. Then about 100 or 200 years later, a guy by the name of Muhammad al-Khwarizmi, somewhere in the Middle East, around Baghdad, discovered the very foundation of mathematics. It was called al-Jabr, which later on became called algebra, which became the foundation of mathematical equations that would allow humanity to better travel, to better transport from one place to another, and to be able to discover and ascertain the names of many of the stuff that's in our planetary system. But then a major disruption took place. While we saw the peak of the Abbasid civilization, which lasted about 400 years, there was a major disruption in the 13th century by way of the Mongols. They disrupted arguably two things. The first one would have been how the Abbasid civilization was thriving for hundreds of years, but also at the same time the Han civilization in China. It was the first major technological, economic, geopolitical disruption that Asia was involved in. Then about 100 or 200 years later, the spiritual landscape of Asia and the world changed by way of the capture and siege over Constantinople, which would have been the base for Orthodox Christianity for many, many years, by way of the overtaking by the Islamic rule, which lasted in the later called city of Istanbul for hundreds of years, until the end of the First Great World War. Then, something in Indonesia happened again. Some may know, many don't know. There is an island in the Moluccas, which is in the eastern part of Indonesia, by the name of Rune. Rune was arguably one of, if not the richest, spice island in the world. It became the source of skirmishes, hostilities, battles, and wars between the English and the Dutch, just over that piece of natural resource called nutmeg. After tens of years, they finally signed a treaty, which didn't get honored. Then 10 years later, they signed another treaty, which would have been reflected upon the same stuff that they signed 10 years before. And that island was basically the basis for an exchange of two real estates. One in Rome, another one in a place that was then called New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam was the name by the Dutch for a place that's now called Manhattan. So in the end, the Dutch were able to control Rune Island, and the English were given what was then called New Amsterdam, which later on became Manhattan. Imagine if it would have been the other way around. Fifth Avenue would be in Indonesia. The Wall Street banks would be in the Moluccas. That's what the Indonesians are thinking. But then, a couple of hundred years later, there was a guy by the name of Raffles, Thomas Stamford Raffles, who basically decided to set foot in a little tiny island by the name of Singapore. And that was soon after the agreement by the same two nations of Holland and England as to swap the respective real estate between Bengkulu, which in English was called Bencoolen, and Singapore. So the Dutch were able to get that piece of real estate in Sumatra in Indonesia, and the English were able to get that tiny island called Singapore. But interestingly, in the 17th century, we had what arguably could have been the first largest market capitalization in history in present value terms. It was a company called VOC, or the Dutch East Indies, which basically thrived on the vision of selling the dreams of being able to trade on natural resources coming from Asia, predominantly Indonesia. And in present value terms, the market capitalization of that very company would have been $7.9 trillion. 8 times the value of Apple, 8 times the value of Amazon. And this would have happened in the 17th century. But the unique thing about this corporation was that it was given the mandate to utilize military capabilities, to take over sovereignty, to take over military opponents, to take over natural resources that belong to anybody in the world. Uniquely destined, uniquely mandated, in contrast to many of the corporations we see today. But it didn't last. It became bankrupt. It was taken over by the Dutch government, and that was actually the early parts that precipitated the colonial periods of Asia, being done by the European powers back then, and it changed the world. It changed the world. For instance, Southeast Asia would have been grazed by Buddhism for 400 years, Hinduism for 600 years, Islam, colonialism, Christianity, and later on, until soon after the Second Great War, we became a democracy. We became a democracy, for the most part. You could argue that 2 of the 3 largest democracies in the world are actually in Asia. India, the largest democracy, and Indonesia, the 3rd largest democracy in the world. It seems to be thriving. It's got its own challenges, but no reason for the people of India, Indonesia, and Asia not to be able to thrive through these challenging times. Now, if you take a look at the global population, 100,000 years ago, the population of the world would have been about 1 million. Fast forward to about 10,000 years ago, 5 million. 5,000 years ago, 10 million. 2,000 years ago, 300 million. And from 300 million about 2,000 years ago, the progression has been unprecedented. It went up to the first billion by 1820, the second billion by 1920, the third billion by 1950, and ever since then, every incremental billion of the planet's population was attained in a period of around 15 years. To the point today we're looking at each other amongst humanity that has about 7.4 billion on this planet. Where is this going to go? It's only going to go up as long as we stay peaceful. It's only going to go up as long as we stay stable. But if we fight off each other, we're not going to be able to sustain the growth. And we're going to be able, or we're going to have to be able to feed ourselves. And Southeast Asia has been known as a miracle. With a population of 650 million people, we've been able to be peaceful and stable. Because of peace and stability, we've been able to grow economically robustly. At growth rates of 5, 6, 7, 8% for the last few decades. China is doing the same thing because of peace and stability. India is doing the same thing because of peace and stability, with the exception of a few days ago. Then, if you go back to 1850, until the year 2000, we consume about 350 gigatons of carbon in a 150-year period. And then from the year 2000 until 2015, we were able to consume the same amount, 350 gigatons of carbon. And then from the year 2015 until 2030, we're supposed to consume about 500 gigatons of carbon. Now, if you talk to any scientist, you talk to any leaderships of natural resource companies, Beyond 2030, we're only going to have about 3,000 to 4,000 gigatons of carbon left. At the rate we're consuming, we may only have about 70 to 80 years left worth of humanity. Unless we renew our ways of energizing. Unless we renew our ways of economizing. Unless we renew our ways of politicizing. Unless we renew our habits and lifestyles. And the young generation is the major beneficiary of the declination of the price of money. By way of demographics, as people get older on this planet, the savings have gone up and are likely to continue going up. But at the same time, the number of asset classes is remaining constant, as a result of which the price of money has been declining and is likely to continue to decline. Compounded by monetarist capabilities, particularly in the last 10 to 11 years, of easing their economies quantitatively. We've seen about $15 trillion worth of liquidity being pumped into the systems in the major economies of the US, ECB, Japan, the UK, and to some extent China. $15 trillion, that's a lot of donuts. Because of that, we've seen the gap ever increasing between the inflation of financial assets and the inflation of the real economies. You take a look at the S&P 500, 2008 until today, it's gone up by 250%. Whereas the real economies of the US and other developed economies have gone up 40% in the last 10 to 11 years. That gap between the inflation of financial assets and the inflation of real economies has made conversations very difficult with respect to internationalism, globalization, multilateralism, as a result of which we've seen spectra of politics, economics, social structure being polarized. As a result of which we're seeing symptoms being vomited by economic societies, political societies around the world that make you go, what? It's tough to understand some of the conversations that are being struck by leaderships or wannabe leaderships in developed economies and developing economies. And the last few decades, you know this better than I do, Gordon Moore predicted in 1965 that the capability of a memory chip was going to double every couple of years while the costs are also going to go down. And we've seen that so accurately moving in the right direction until today. And it's likely to continue in the next decade or two. We've seen the cost of trade coming down. Yes, you could argue that there's some tension between China and the US. But if you take a look at the current account of China, you take a look at the number of people that actually shop at Walmart, it makes no sense for there not to be any policy recalibration by the two countries. It only makes logical sense for the two countries and the two economies and the two policy-making bodies to recalibrate their policy postures so that it makes sense for the rest of the world. So, since the World War II until 1989, humanity has been embracing main ideologies of fascism, communism, and democracy. Ever since the tearing down of the wall, we kind of got stuck with just democracy. But we've moved from the era of defined benefit. Previously, all you got to do is just cling on to one particular ideology, you get whatever you want. You get your economic aid, you get your military aid, you get your technological aid, as long as you embrace one particular ideology or the other. But now, we have gone into the era of defined contribution. You pretty much get, depending on what you contribute onto the table. If you don't contribute onto the table, you're not going to get anything in terms of technology, economic support, military support, and what have you. So the question remains as to where we're going to go from now on. two very interesting geopolitical events involving the European powers and the US power. These are Western civilizations that have thrived in the last 200 to 300 years. They're at a point where they need to revisit what they've been doing all along. But if you take a look at Europe, they've got this not small issue of immigration from the Middle East, which I think, or we all think, is likely to preoccupy the European minds for the next few decades. While at the same time, the US has gone to a point of becoming so much more energy independent, to the point they're now producing more oil in Saudi Arabia, more than 11 million barrels of oil per day. Because of this, I think they can afford to spend less time, less effort, and less energy on the Middle East issues, and spend those resources on a more proper issue, inclusive of China. The rise of China is incredible. The US has got to be able to decide, because at the moment what we're seeing is that China is coming to the table with the kind of self-efficacy that they can solve anything by way of how they've been doing things. And the US at the same time is coming to the table with the kind of self-efficacy that they can solve any problem with the way the US have been able to fix problems. And unfortunately, the two don't reconcile. But no reason for us not to be optimistic about any possibility of reconciliation. Economically, you go back 2,000 years, the economies of India and China occupied 70% of the global economy. 2,000 years ago. Not very long. Not very long ago, if you put that in the context of what we've gone through in the last 100,000 years. And now, we are on the verge of basically surpassing the 50% mark in terms of the occupation of Asia's economy with respect to the global economic province. And it's only going to go up. So there was a blip for about 200 years when the Western civilizations were occupying a good chunk of the economic province. But now that province is likely to be game-changed. So, in the context of a more bilateralized conversation, because of that gap between the inflation of financial assets and the inflation of real economies, in the context of how difficult it is to explain somebody in Mankato, Minnesota, somebody in Mamuju, Sulawesi, somebody in Mymensingh, Bangladesh, about how globalization actually translates to humanity's sheer ability to put food on the table, it's going to boil down to one's respective marginal productivity on a PPP adjusted basis. Bilateral negotiations are getting tougher, and bilateral negotiations are only going to benefit those with higher marginal productivity, as opposed to those with lower marginal productivity. And from this picture, Singapore is the beneficiary, because they got a marginal productivity of about $130,000. That's the ability of the average Singaporean to produce goods and services per person per year on a PPP adjusted basis, $131,000. Whereas Laos, $11,500. Whereas Cambodia, $6,200. Whereas India, $16,000. Japan, $78,000. China, $24,000. South Korea, $65,000. So it depends on the degree to which each one of these economies would like to progress themselves by way of investing in a good education, good technology, good innovation, good conversations. So, it's a lot of numbers here. If you take a look at China with a population of 1.4 billion, China has got 42 million students. India, with a population of 1.3, has got over 30 million students. ASEAN has got more than 10 million students at all universities in Southeast Asia. So you've got over 10 million in Southeast Asia, over 30 million in India, over 40 million in China. The question is, How are we going to spend going forward in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50 years? I can give you an example of Indonesia. Indonesia legislated to the extent that we're going to be spending 20% of our budget for educational purposes. You take a 26-year view until 2045, we're going to be able to spend $5 trillion in future value for educational purposes. That's going to be enough, or more than enough, to replace all the dilapidated buildings in Indonesia, and hopefully to occupy campuses around the world, including this beautiful campus, with more Indonesians, so that they get the best education possible. The Chinese are doing that, the Indians are doing that, the Southeast Asians are trying to repeat what they used to be able to do. They're trying to replicate what the Chinese and the Indians are doing. But the Gini index has gone up for China, for Southeast Asia, for Middle East. This is largely underpinned by that gap between the inflation of financial assets and the inflation of real economies. But to the extent that each particular country is going to be spending more money on education, the ability and capacity to narrow that very gap is only going to go up, so that the conversations are going to be much more of the necessary wisdom. Going back to the Tang Dynasty, the use of paper, you ever wonder how much out there is in the money supply? It's about $95 trillion. If you want to go by the gold standard, which would have been abolished by Nixon a few decades ago, there's only about $1.3 trillion worth of gold. That backs up about $95 trillion worth of money. So that phrase, "in God we trust," aptly applies. You got to trust God that paper is going to be worth something. Because it's not backed proportionally by the amount of gold that's sitting in all central banks around the world. So, technologically, the cost of storing data has dramatically come down. Just in the last few years, it's come down by 95%. And 90% of the world's data has been created in a mere 4 years before today. Amazingly. And this is all going to benefit you guys and the future generations of humanity. Asia, with 4 billion people, half of that, they have access to the internet by way of their computers, by way of their smartphones, and what have you. And that 2 billion figure is only going to go up to 100% of the population. It's only a matter of time, just by way of the fact that only 2 billion people have access to the internet in Asia out of a population of 4 billion. They have already occupied the GDP of Asia to the extent of almost 10% digitally. So the digital economy, which is still single digit, it's going to be double digit very soon with respect to the overall GDP of Asia. It's only a matter of time that digital economy figure is going to go up to a much bigger figure. It could happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And if you go by the assumption that 50% of Asia's GDP is related to their domestic consumptive propensity, you go by the assumption that Asia's economy is about $30 to $35 trillion, right there you know there's about $17 to $18 trillion worth of consumptive propensity that could be digitalized. And only a minuscule portion of that is digitalized as of today. So if you think there's a lot of unicorns already, no. Asia only has about 108 unicorns. The rest of the world have more than 200 unicorns. In the next 10 years, we're likely to see 1,000 more unicorns coming out of Asia. And hopefully, a good chunk of that will come from this campus. Southeast Asia, very nascent stage. In terms of the role of the digital economy, it's less than 10%, just about 7%. It typifies the landscape, the contour of the digital landscape of Asia. The need for human resources in terms of business managers, in terms of data scientists, is huge to tap and capitalize upon that prospect of going up from 5 to 10% of the total economy to 50% of the economy. The number of unicorns, 310 all over the world, 108 in Asia, some in Southeast Asia, many in China, quite many in India, but I think there's going to be a lot more in India, China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. So, this is the end game. By 2045 to 2050, Asian economies are going to be in the top 5 in a big way. You got China, you got India, you got Southeast Asia, and at that time, Southeast Asia would be the 4th largest economy in the world. And by that time, Indonesia still remains as the 3rd largest democracy in the world, as the 4th most populous nation in the world. India being the largest democracy, getting even a bigger democracy. This is where we are. Out of 800 something Nobel Prize winners, only 74 come from Asia. And you know what? Many of those 74 are actually Americans and Europeans with Asian names. And what a mockery. We have not won a single World Cup championship. The Koreans got close. The Southeast Asians never got there. The Indians, I don't want to say it. Olympic gold medals, not even 10% of the total tally. The GDP I've already talked about. It's only a matter of time if we believe in linearity. The number of unicorns, it's only a matter of time. That figure is going to change big time in the next 5 years. The number of cars, we're going to surpass the rest of the world. While we know that we're polluting the world. Oscars, only 51. We need more crazy rich Asians. Okay. You know, having gone on this journey of 100,000 years, Asia has gone through a historic, emotional, political, economic, cultural, and geopolitical journey. Ever since a large eruption in northern part of Sumatra, ever since the discovery of the clay tablets in the southern parts of Mesopotamia, we have read more than 300 million books. We have listened to more than 180 million songs, including Gangnam. We have embraced monotheism. We have pursued science like you've never believed. We've shaped the world. And if anybody out there thinks that Asia is not going to be able to shape the world, think again. Asia has got aspirations. Asia has got innovations. Asia has got emotions. Asia has got sensibilities. Asia has got sensitivities. Asia has got gumption. Asia has got mental fortitude. And most importantly, Asia has got patience. As to be able to shape the world for the better of humanity. Thank you very much. I'm supposed to take questions, so.
Yes, so if you have any questions, you can go to the microphones placed on the aisle and ask your questions there.
Wait, what? Hi. Oh, just wanted to say it's obviously a big honor for you to be here, so thank you for that. One question I just had around, the future of Asia, just out of pure curiosity, what are the spaces or sort of like, niches that you see could create maybe outsized growth in the near future? Maybe talk about some areas that you see, far more potential to have proliferation in versus other areas. So just wanted to get your thoughts around that.
Well, the low-hanging fruit is, how do you address financial exclusiveness, right, in Asia? Take Southeast Asia, for example. You've got financial inclusion, for the most part, of less than 40%, right? 40% being the percentage of those that are 15 years old or older that have access to capital, access to bank accounts. So how do you come up with a plan or a business plan that will basically increase that percentage? And this is not unique of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Singapore. Singapore has got a financial inclusion of 95%. And the 5% is not because they don't have access. They don't want to have access, right? But for the most part in Southeast Asia, India, I think China, it's the same. So that would be, I think, not the niche, but the obvious niche that anybody with a bright mind would want to tap into. You take a look at some of the recent unicorns in Southeast Asia. Name a few. Some, I'm not going to mention names, on the basis of ride-hailing, but their end game is really to be able to connect the dots so that people could actually borrow and lend. Right? The peer-to-peer conversations are staggering in that part of the world. Yes, they've been able to attach this tube onto a pre-existing economic activity of selling shampoos or kwetiaos or whatever, but what we're seeing staggeringly is that the economic activity has actually gone up by multiples of 3 to 5. Previously this guy would have been selling kwetiaos of maybe $100 a day. Now he or she is selling $300 to $400 a day by way of that digitalization. And now they're looking at the back end as to how the supply chain could be capitalized upon by that digital technology. So in the end, I think the potential is how you get from 5 to 10% of the GDP being digitalized to about 50% of the economy being digitalized. Because 50% is really the measurement of the consumptive propensity of the respective economies in Asia.
Got it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I wanted to ask you more about your vision for more inclusive human capital development and education, because obviously at institutions like Harvard, there are only so many people from Asia that can be educated here every year. How can education be spread out more evenly among the billions of people in the entire community?
Well, I spend quite a bit of time on education nowadays, just to prove the point that talent is universal, but opportunities are not, right? And there's a lot of people in Asia that are dodging bullets that could actually score better than most of you in artificial intelligence courses, but they're just not given the opportunity. So I think the digital platform is an area that could actually increase inclusion in a big way. I've talked to quite a number of these guys, but we haven't really seen the kind of scale that they would have and we would have wanted to see. I don't know if it's a question of just mobile penetration or a question of something else. What I can say in Indonesia is happening is that the challenge is not to just create the tube through which you want to send the contents, but the challenge is more with respect to coming up with the right content. And coming up with the right content is not easy. You got to get the right teachers. And you got to get the right tutorials or tutors that can actually say the right stuff, that can be funneled through that tube so that this kid in Papua, this kid in Bangladesh, this kid in Phnom Penh could understand whatever that content is being piped through. So is that going to change? I think so. I think the way the conversations are being struck now and in the near foreseeable future, I think we're likely to see some real game changing in the educational space in terms of increasing inclusion. Now, in order to get more Asians at campuses like this, it's a question of fiscal space, right? I can use the Indonesian example. 12 years ago, our fiscal space was less than a fifth of today's fiscal space. So we have quadrupled the size of our fiscal wisdom in a period of 11 or 12 years, which is staggering. And because of that, now we can spend a lot of money on education. Last year alone, we spent $30 billion on education. But most of that leaked, to be quite fair. But a good chunk of that was used to replace all the old buildings that were dilapidated. And a good chunk of that is being used to send people overseas to North America, to Australia, Japan, China, and Europe. You take the long 20 to 25 year view, I think the numbers are just going to change staggeringly. Yeah.
Good morning, Mr. Wirjawan. I should say it's so inspiring of your keynote speech today. I just took in my notes in your slide, the final one. There should be no reason for our Asia to continue influencing the world. To be honest, as an Asian student in America in myself more than 10 years, I have never, to be honest, think about this serious issue. But today, I learned from you. So I just have a quick question. So it seems in your keynote speech covers a lot of issues. So my simple question is just that want to listen to your personal opinion. So far, what's the challenge facing all the Asian countries? And specifically, do you think, in our opinion, all the Asian community should follow the traditional model as the Western countries, or based on our maybe a little bit different, unique culture, history, as you just mentioned, details information. Maybe we will have some kind of unique, different business model, or broadly direct model. Thank you.
That's a 2-week seminar. Look, I'll say this very simply that I think the political models of the world are likely to change, right? Actually, we had this conversation last night about neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism is basically an enhancement of liberalism. The idea, or pre-existing idea of liberalizing the individual for his and her own liberty should be expanded to the point of basically liberating and liberalizing the markets, right? But what we have found in the last 20 years is that the liberalization of the markets hasn't really yielded equality, right? It was designed as for everybody to have access to capital by way of the liberalization of the market. But consequently, only very few have had access to capital. Great many have not. Is this something that's going to be perennial? No. I think people are beginning to see this as a symptom that's concerning. And a good thing about it is people are actually smart enough to repurpose, right? And they want to basically make sure that this is going to be tailored. So that slide that I put up there in terms of the ideological orientation, China, I think, has successfully embraced socialism with Chinese characteristics. And some others, India and Indonesia, have embraced democracy. But are we going to be truly democratic like the way democracy's been functioning in Western civilizations? Not necessarily. I think there's going to be tweaking. And all those, I think, are going to entail in the alteration of the business models, right? But at the end, I think it depends on the degree to which you're committed to basically educating the society. And what I'm seeing in terms of what China is doing in terms of educating its society, and India and Southeast Asia increasingly, I think it's pretty phenomenal. So I don't take the 2-3 year view, but I take the 20-30 year view. I think you're going to see lots of changes, but I think for the better. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for being here. As an active investor in Indonesia for the last 8 years in the VC space, watching your work and the work of your those after you at BKPM has been amazing. One question I have for you is, as you make this comment about neoliberalization, going forward, one of the things that we've been thinking about is the idea of the pan-Southeast Asia unicorns and things like that. As you start to see countries become more tied to the idea that critical infrastructure, such as financial services, education, logistics, and everything are being essentially directed or owned by these digital platforms. Maybe if you could share a little bit of what you're seeing around this conversation, especially as large Chinese companies start making strategic investments in the region, maybe the rise of nationalism, where people are feeling like, hey, we watched what's gone on in the West, and we don't want to make those same mistakes. And then as it filters down through to technological platforms, what do you think will be some of those things that will happen within Southeast Asia to make sure that government feels comfortable, and then also private enterprise can actually scale across the region and you can continue to attract venture and private equity funding?
Well, I think there's two things. The first one is that the increase of nationalistic rhetoric or fervor is not unique to Southeast Asia. You might even see it here. You might even see it in Sweden. You might even see it in Italy or Austria and developed economies. But I think we can hypothesize that a good chunk of that is because of that gap that I talked about, right? So as long as a particular government, country, or nation is clear in addressing that, I think we've got less to worry about in terms of nationalistic rhetoric, right? And I've always held a very different definition of nationalism. Nationalism is not about who owns. Nationalism is about who benefits. It can be owned by anybody, within or beyond. But if the people within benefit, that's nationalistic. But a lot of people don't hold that sort of a definition of nationalism. Now, the question is, are people going to be able to understand that sort of definition of nationalism? I think so. But it's not going to happen in 6 months. But if there's a clear, well-defined methodology of addressing that gap, and it doesn't have to be absolutism, determinism, in that it happens today, but it just directionally looks like it's going to get fixed sometime in the future, I think we've got less to worry about.
Okay, because we only have 3 more minutes for our Q&A, can I ask the 3 attendees there to just give your question brief and ask it all at once, and Mr. Wirjawan will answer it all together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minister. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have just 2 very quick questions. The first is about education, as you mentioned about the importance of our future growth for ASEAN and also other countries in Asia. We saw a lot of students from those countries that are studying overseas. What's your point of view about students who doesn't have whose parents or whose family background doesn't really necessarily have such financial support that gives them to study overseas? What's your past experience? What kind of things government can do in order to improve their domestic education? And the second question is about ASEAN. As a huge alliance, significantly, especially maintaining peace in the South Asian countries for the last 12 decades, that's especially important for regional prosperities. However, there are huge disparities in terms of growth, economic, and productivities. How could the ASEAN countries, how could ASEAN as an organization help those countries in South Asia countries bring them together and try to bring them globally, but not just only regionally? Thank you.
I'll take the next question.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight. My question is really short. So number of cross-border margin acquisition has been increasing significantly. And my question is how does the increase of cross-border margin acquisition will impact the development of Asia? Thank you.
In a good way. Does that help?
Little more detail?
Look, I think there's going to be a lot of consolidation in many parts of the world. We're seeing that here in some sectors. We're seeing that in Europe. We're seeing that in Asia. In Southeast Asia, I think the tech world is going to go through some sort of consolidation in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. They have to, right? And I think cross-border activities are going to depend largely on clarity with respect to the regulatory framework. And it's not just the framework, but the enforcement of the framework. The more it becomes clear in terms of how it gets enforced, then I think the more opportunities there are for consolidation, activities. With respect to the earlier questions on education, I think the disparity is there, but it has narrowed in the last 50 to 60 years, ever since ASEAN was founded in 1967, because of peace and stability and because of the conversations with each other amongst the 10 nations. And that's the good thing about ASEAN. People used to try to compare between ASEAN and the European Union. We're not unionized from an immigration standpoint, from a monetary standpoint, but we're unionized culturally. And the cultural understanding of each other, I think, has helped all of us to try to help each other bring about wisdom onto the table, be it economic, educational, social, cultural, and political security. People ask me questions about what's going to happen in the South China Sea. I'm a true believer of the code of conduct, in that I think there's going to be continuing peace in the South China Sea. Our relations and relationships with China have always been commercial and economic, with the exception of who and what, the Mongols, right? But for thousands of years we've been peacefully coexisting, and there's no reason for us not to be able to coexist peacefully. And in terms of getting somebody to get educated in a beautiful campus like this one, just take a look at the fiscal space of the respective economies. As soon as that fiscal space goes up, there's going to be incremental capability and ability to send somebody, in the event that the parents are not able to send their kids over to a good campus. Yeah?
All right.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr.